I am proud that Wheaton is my chosen home. I am, to be honest, a little happy to leave Washington, D.C., since we seem to be in some kind of political twilight zone. Would any of you have believed a year and a half ago, or a year ago, if I had stood here and said that 1 year from now, the GOP frontrunner would be Donald Trump, and that he would conduct a two-way insult war with the Pope? Step back a minute and just think about that. These two men, one, a world leader who connects to deep longings and sets the terms of our cultural debate, whose very words are spoken ex cathedra and followed by millions of the faithful. The other man is the Bishop of Rome. It's my intention to wonk out a bit this evening, talking about what justice means in the here and now, especially for young people in our broken criminal justice system. But I'll start by telling you just a little bit about myself. A few of you may have vaguely recognized me, or at least my glasses. The most common thing I hear at airports after I've made an appearance on Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour is, "Oh, you're that guy who's not David Brooks." My first job out of Wheaton was working as a researcher for Chuck Colson, one of the great social reformers of the 20th century. And I saw how prison ministry works, and I met people who had committed terrible crimes who were far more mature Christians than I could ever hope to be. It was really, for me, an example of what renewal can mean. But I had the political bug. I was a policy staffer on Capitol Hill. I was a low-level speechwriter during the 1996 campaign. Took a detour into journalism. And then in the spring of 1999, when I was senior editor at U.S. News and World Report, I got a call from then Governor George W. Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at a hotel in D.C. The first thing he said was, "This isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address, and I want you to move to Austin immediately." At that point, he wasn't even a declared candidate, but his confidence was infectious, and I loaded up my family in the car and went. From the start, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He's outgoing, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and as a person. He is casual, funny, authentic, and kind and loyal to the people around him. And he can also occasionally be sharp-tongued. I'll tell you one story. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a timed question and answer. At one of these sessions, the late Peter Jennings asked Bush, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." The pace of that time was truly exhausting, and it takes a toll on your health, it takes a toll on your family. But after the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed significantly. I became a policy advisor focused on global health and development and other issues the president was concerned about. My best experience in government, bar none, was sitting in the Oval Office and watching George W. Bush embrace PEPFAR, the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, the largest effort to fight a single disease in human history. When we announced that program in 2003 in the State of the Union address, about 50,000 people were on treatment in all of sub-Saharan Africa. And some countries were very much living in the shadow of death. Today, thanks to PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and increasing contributions of countries themselves, there are 11 million people living on AIDS treatment in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the reason I will never be skeptical about the ability of government under the right circumstances to do great good. And it's the reason I will never be cynical about President Bush. When working on the global AIDS issue at the White House, I got to know Bono of U2 a bit. He invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, which was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." As the head of speechwriting at the White House, I had an office in the West Wing. Back then, there was a TV show by the same name in which Rob Lowe, who some consider a handsome guy, played the character who held my job. We even met a few times. And I remember my wife, Dawn, at parties telling people with great disappointment and regret in her voice, "Any resemblance to real persons, living and dead, is purely coincidental." I've also met Angelina Jolie. My wife was there too, I think. Or so she tells me. Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, living on the tyranny of 2 deadlines a week. I had a column that I had to file this morning. I'm a fellow at the One campaign, a grassroots organization dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. And I'm a fellow at the Center for Public Justice, what I think is the most serious and respected institution in Washington, dealing with education, issues of education and poverty from a specifically Protestant Christian perspective. I live most of my life in the realm of political controversy, and I'm happy to talk to any of you in the hall afterwards about Donald Trump. But I have a different focus tonight. I've participated in 3 presidential campaigns and written about 3 more, and I have never seen a political environment less connected to the values and priorities of the Christian faith or to the real needs of the country. We're seeing what I've described as the politics of the middle finger, the philosophy hit and run, and burn, baby, burn. This is not only bad for the soul, it is bad for the mind. It actively obscures the real problems and real answers that should be at the heart of American politics. There's a lot of talk in both parties about the death of the American dream, and for many, it is frail or failing. And I want to get to that topic. But populists in both parties are contending that the American dream has in fact been stolen. It may have been an inside job done by Wall Street or wealthy political donors, or it may have been the work of outsiders, such as illegal immigrants, the Mexican government, or Chinese competitors. But our economic problem is viewed as a crime that someone committed. As economic analysis, this is generally wrong, shallow, or partial. But it's the political consequences that concern me. If the American dream has been stolen, the main purpose of politics is not to propose policies and solve this problem or that. It is to define, fight, and defeat the enemies who stole the dream. This approach to public life is inherently personal, inherently conflict-oriented. Our economic problems have faces. They may be owned by sneering billionaires or have a more Latino or Asian aspect, but they certainly don't look like us. They are the scheming, the exploiters, the guilty, the other. This gives rise to a politics characterized by anger, retribution, and enmity. It has the chemical advantage of lighting up the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. And if I remember my Psych 101 correctly, this portion of the brain includes the hypothalamus, which regulates the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. A hypothalamic politics can't be oriented towards consensus. In any economic theory that involves fighting the bad guys, progress is a zero-sum game. Some must lose for the virtuous to win. There are many problems here, but the worst is misdiagnosis because it undermines the possibility of productive change. The American dream has not been stolen. It has been undermined by a vast economic transition that has placed American workers in competition with talented workers around the world and replaced whole categories of labor with new technologies. This has resulted in a consistent downward pressure on wages and a ruthless demand for higher skills. For many people and many communities, this means a more or less permanent recession. The effective collapse of the blue-collar economy has come at the same time that working-class family structures have dramatically weakened, and community institutions, which once provided assistant or substitute parents, have fallen apart. Some social scientists emphasize one part of this problem or another, but family, community, and economic challenges seem related to one another in complex ways. It is an all-of-the-above problem. And I warned you that I would be wonky. It's also wonky to do book recommendations, so I have two of them for you today. The first, of course, is Unleashing Opportunity, which you should read. The second is Our Kids, by my friend Robert Putnam at Harvard University. I think one of the most important sociological texts of our time. Bob deals with all these economic trends that are causing instability, worry, and toxic stress, particularly for working class people. And he also connects the dots on the human side. Putnam sent researchers to his own hometown of Port Clinton, Ohio, an old factory town where many good-paying blue-collar jobs are now vanished, a community similar to many in this part of the country. One interviewer talked with a real woman given the fictional name of Mary Sue. Her parents divorced when she was small. Her mother started stripping for a living and would leave for days at a time. Her new stepmother would beat her and confine her to a single room. Mary Sue told the researcher that her only friend at this time of her life was a mouse who lived in the apartment. She went to juvenile detention for selling pot. One boyfriend burned her on the arm with a cigarette. Her current boyfriend had 2 other children by 2 other women. I find this a haunting image. A little girl abandoned by people who should have loved her, kept company by a mouse. What does opportunity possibly mean in a case like this? Putnam calls this case distressingly typical in working class communities. The result, he argues, is a durable, deepening national division increasingly rooted in class. This is an attack on the self-image of America. Americans are generally comfortable with the existence of inequality in a free economy as long as economic advancement is a realistic goal. But economic inequality without the possibility of economic mobility is just a caste system in which birth equals destiny. This problem is an economic challenge. We're talking about perhaps 1/3 of American workers coming from circumstances that do not fully prepare them for productive contribution in a modern economy. 1/3 of workers betrayed by the circumstances of their birth. And this problem is a moral challenge. The Mary Sues of this world did nothing to deserve their circumstances. In a class-based society, the most important choice you ever make is who your parents are, which is not a choice at all. This is a good definition of economic injustice, massive disadvantage without doing anything to deserve it. And I think this is a moment of testing for Christians in our public life, in our common life. You hear a lot of talk in Christian circles about defending religious liberty. And I believe it is essential for Christian institutions to be able to act and organize according to their deepest beliefs. But let me put this bluntly. If the Christian message to the broader culture consists of defending our own rights and defending our own values and our own institutions, we will be one interest group among many, and that would be failure. We succeed by standing for a society and an economy that makes the ideal of human dignity at the heart of our debates. And that means caring about our wonky crisis of mobility, about broken families and fractured communities, about the crisis of the blue-collar economy, and caring about what goes on behind prison walls. It's our job, private sector and public sector, federal, state, and local parents, leaders, even columnists, to help our fellow citizens find the skills and opportunities and practical help they need to succeed in a very difficult time. I won't summarize all of Unleashing Opportunity, But I'll ease into our panel by talking just a little bit about justice for young people. My former boss, Chuck Colson, often employed a vivid image when he spoke on this issue. Many people, he said, view the prison system like they view the sewage system. They want to flush problems away without thinking about where they go. This was the attitude, consciously or unconsciously, behind the growth of mass incarceration in the 1980s and 1990s. Prisons were built and filled, but remained largely hidden from public view. By 2006, roughly 1 out of every 32 Americans was held in the justice system. This approach extended to youth offenders as well. Fears of youth crime and violence from super predators led to mandatory adult court for a number of offenses. Many young people were warehoused for long periods in large juvenile justice facilities. Few Americans had contact with this system except corrections officials and those involved in prison ministry. And with crime rates dropping during that period, mass incarceration seemed to be working. But it was not working in places like New York's Rikers Island detention facility. It is located in the middle of the East River, reachable only by a single unmarked bridge. Along with thousands of adult prisoners, nearly 800 juvenile offenders are also housed. A 2014 report by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York revealed a, quote, broken institution where violence is commonplace, solitary confinement is routine, and about half the youth population is diagnosed with mental health issues. It is a place, the report said, where brute force is the first impulse rather than the last resort, where verbal insults are repaid with physical injuries, where beatings are routine, where accountability is rare, and where a culture of violence endures even while a code of silence prevails. Prison staff is poorly equipped to deal with belligerent adolescents suffering from serious mental and behavioral disorders. The result is, quote, a corrections crucible that seems more inspired by the Lord of the Flies than by any legitimate philosophy of humane detention, end quote. Isolating some young offenders is unavoidable. About 12% of delinquent youth are placed in residential facilities because they have committed serious crimes, such as murder, rape, robbery, and assault. But many others are incarcerated for violating parole or showing disrespect towards judges, probation officers, and other officials. By some estimates, about 40% of juvenile detentions result from nonviolent offenses, such as violations of probation, drug possession, and public order offenses. And some young people with mental health conditions are dumped in facilities because there are no other treatment options. As a result of all these factors, America has an estimated 60 to 70,000 juvenile offenders in correctional and residential facilities at any given time. While this number has declined in recent years, it still represents, by far, the highest juvenile incarceration rate in the world. There is a vocabulary word taken from medicine that is useful in this area of public policy. Iatrogenic. It means a disease caused by the medical treatment, an attempted cure that results in a complication. The incarceration of young people in large facilities is iatrogenic. It leads to routinely high recidivism rates. A variety of studies have found that 70 to 80% of incarcerated youth are rearrested shortly after release, within a few years after release. And there are predictable negative results on education and unemployment. By one estimate, 66% of juveniles who are incarcerated never return to school, which dramatically undermines their prospects in the labor market. And all these bad results are achieved at an absurdly high cost, often 10 times the expense of sending a child to a good state university. A growing body of data is revealing what works in reducing juvenile recidivism and what doesn't. Programs showing evidence-based promise share some characteristics. They try to keep offenders within communities instead of warehousing them with other criminals. They offer mental health and substance abuse treatment, and they often include intensive family treatment, meaning that instead of merely focusing on the child, these programs try to build up the family support structure around the child. This approach often involves several visits a week by counselors who work with the offender and their caregivers to confront specific factors: lack of supervision, poor academic skills, lack of impulse control. In extreme cases of family dysfunction, a child may be placed for 6 months in specially trained foster homes while caregivers are given intensive training in parenting skills. This type of family intervention does not always work, of course, but studies have shown reductions in recidivism of about 20%. And there is a reason for this success. These programs attempt to strengthen the social institution that is designed to give guidance to youth, the family, instead of trying to replace it with prison guards and parole officers who are very poor substitutes. This is a case study in the principle of subsidiarity. Government is often most effective when it acts to strengthen other social institutions instead of acting directly. It is true to say children need strong families that surround them with love and rules, but it is not sufficient. Many children lack this advantage, and it is not enough to complain about social conditions. Government needs to act, but it should first try to act in ways that strengthen families rather than ignoring or replacing them. Family intervention programs are one way to accomplish that goal. The issue of juvenile justice also demonstrates the principle of subsidiarity in another way. Most of the important legal changes on this issue are taking place at the state rather than the federal level. There are some important federal laws being considered, but the lion's share of criminal justice reform takes place in state legislatures, where citizens often have more direct access and influence. Many states have begun placing dangerous youth in smaller, treatment-oriented facilities and started diverting nonviolent youth towards community-based monitoring programs. The results are often dramatic. I'll give you a few figures. From 1996 to 2010, the population of incarcerated juveniles in the state of California dropped by 85%. During the same period, juvenile crime rates also declined dramatically, undermining the naive connection we make between incarceration rates and public safety. And these reforms have not only taken root in progressive states. Following the Texas juvenile justice scandals, most juvenile offenders were moved to community supervision in Texas. In 2006, the daily confinement of juveniles in Texas was about 4,800. By 2010, it was about 1,800. During the same period, arrests for violent juvenile felonies fell by 10%. Money saved from lower rates of incarceration was given to parole departments to fund expanded services and treatment. According to recent studies, juveniles involved in Texas community-based programs are 20% less likely to be repeat offenders and 3 times less likely to commit serious crime. Juvenile justice reform is a success story, though a very incomplete one. And it demonstrates the full range of Christian social teaching. It shows the need for government action in pursuit of the common good, but the superiority of solutions that strengthen family and community. Above all, it shows the need for solidarity. The lives and struggles of young people can't simply be hidden away behind walls and razor wire, flushed away to places we never see. No child is disposable. It is necessary to restrict certain risks to society, but also to leave room for second chances. And with that introduction, I'm happy to yield to the true experts on our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you again to all of you for being here tonight. I'm Katie Thompson, and I'm the editor of Shared Justice at the Center for Public Justice. Shared Justice, for the college students in the room, is our online publication for 20 and 30-somethings, where we're thinking about, how does our faith intersect with politics? As a Christian, how am I called to engage in my political community? And what I hear a lot from college students is their desire for a way to engage with some of these really messy, complex issues, a way to bring their faith into the issue and to see real change begin. And I think juvenile justice reform is one of those areas where hopefully by the end of tonight you'll feel inspired to plug in there. So tonight I'll be moderating our conversation. You're going to hear from our panelists for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. We would love to hear from you. And before I do that, let me just briefly introduce who we have. So you have heard from Michael already. You're quite familiar with him. To my left here, we have Karen Swanson, who is the director of the Institute for Prison Ministries at the Billy Graham Center for Evangelism at Wheaton College. As director, she oversees the Charles W. Colson Scholarship Program, serves on the Christian Association for Prisoner Aftercare and Advisory Board, and pursues the goals of the Institute for Prison Ministries through collaboration, networks, and strategic partnerships that provide leadership and training to those engaged in correctional ministries for the advancement of the gospel. And down on the end, we have Stephanie Summers. Stephanie is the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. She is also a member of the advisory board for the Institute for Public Service at Pepperdine University. She earned a master's degree in nonprofit management from Eastern University, where she holds an appointment to the Board of Fellows for the PhD in Organizational Leadership. So my first question for each of you here is, how did you come to be involved in thinking about issues related to criminal justice reform and alternatives? Stephanie, maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks for being here. We're excited about this conversation. So for me, this was an experience that I had in my very first job. I worked as an executive director for a church-based youth center in an inner-city neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we got asked if we would become an alternative sentencing site. And I actually didn't know what that meant. So that would say something about my experience with the juvenile justice kind of framework up until that point. When I found out what it meant, what was explained to me was, you just have these kids who, did some stuff, they're not going to jail, but they need somewhere to do community service, so you need someone who can supervise them, and, you can have them mop the floor or take out trash or stuff like that. And so that was my first entry point into seeing kids in my community who I was serving in the context of that center come into our system and began to understand some of the types of things that we're going to talk about on this panel tonight. But that was my first foray.
I've sort of mentioned mine with Chuck, but I really recall one point that he often made about prison ministry, that it was important in and of itself, but it was also important as a test of our society's commitment to the idea of human dignity, because these are some of the most reviled members of our community. And to assert God's image and moral possibility in prisoners is really to demonstrate the radical and nature of our faith. There really is no one outside of the promise, and it's it's something that proves our general commitment to human dignity in very dramatic ways.
I was first introduced to criminal justice at Cook County Jail in a men's maximum security division, where I was teaching in a faith-based program that was actually led by a chaplain who was a Colson scholar and a Wheaton grad. And it was there that was my first visit and initiation, and there was a growing passion to learn more about correctional ministry And so over 7 years of volunteering and doing some research and doing some reentry ministry, I finally changed careers and have been at the Institute for about 10 years now.
Karen, I'm just going to stay with you, and we're really fortunate to have one of Wheaton's own with us tonight, and I would love for you, just for folks in the room who may not be familiar with the Colson Scholarship, if you could just explain a little bit more about that program.
So the Colson Scholarship is named after Chuck Colson, and it is designed to be a scholarship for someone who has committed a felony. You have to have a felony to be eligible. I don't recommend you doing that, though, just to get a free education. So it's designed for students to come here at Wheaton to be either undergrad or graduate level. And then now we also offer a correctional ministry program, a certificate program through the Institute for Prison Ministries. So it's been around since 1987, and so we've had several scholars who've come through all the different programs.
Stephanie, I want to start with you, and I want to kind of back us up. A lot of times when we think about juvenile justice reform, we're thinking about the things that happen after a conviction. So when we're thinking about youth who are 18 and under, convicted of a crime, where are we sending them and what can reform look like there? But often, a majority of the work and the great need for alternatives and reform is actually prior to conviction. So Stephanie, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about pretrial detention and the impact that that can have on a youth going forward.
Sure. So let me put this really in a stark way. So I personally went to substance abuse treatment when I was 16 years old. And I committed many crimes up until that point for which I was not caught nor prosecuted. The most common reaction to me being caught doing something was to take me home to my parents in the suburbs. Had I been brought up on any kind of charges, I would have appeared before a judge in street clothes with my parents and a lawyer, what I refer to as lawyered up, through the street entrance to the courtroom. And I would have been able to present myself as a responsible member of society. My husband has been a mentee for a young African-American man in Washington, D.C., where we live, for many years, and he's 15 now. And Dee's appearance for the exact same type of thing that I got taken home for would be a completely different experience. Typically, what would happen to him is that he would be detained and then brought before a judge the next day. He would appear from the jail side door into the courtroom, be brought by a bailiff, be wearing clothes provided by the detention facility, and in most courtrooms in the country, he would be shackled because young people are flight risks because they're fast. And the consequence of that image alone presents some significant opportunities for racial disparities in who receives an entry point into the juvenile justice system from something as simple as a kid getting taken home or not if we were brought up on the same charges. So some of the pieces of things that need to change are things like who gets to go home while they await being brought up on some charge. But there are many other places where there's inflection points that I'm sure we will get to. But those are some pretty clear ones that happen again and again and are really reflective of what we see in the juvenile justice system today.
Yeah, I would just add that exactly what you were saying is reflected in the book I mentioned in Our Kids. He goes through the scenarios when kids get in trouble, as kids often do, in educated and upper-class families, you have lawyers and you have substance abuse counselors and you have therapists, and he calls them the airbags. He says when some tragedy happens, the airbags deploy. While in the life of of a young person from a more disadvantaged background, there are none. The airbags don't deploy. And the consequences can be so major in such a short period of time. I was in Cleveland recently at a charter school, an all-male charter school, where they had an innovative program by which they had a life coach, one life coach for every 10 students at this school, who would keep up with their life and make sure that they, if they were arguing with their parents, or they were, had problems at home or academic problems, that these were addressed and talked about in positive ways. And I talked to one of those life coaches and asked him about, his work. And he said, a child in this school, in this neighborhood, can miss their breakfast, have an argument, have a bad day, and ruin the rest of their life. Because they are so close to the criminal justice system and the way it determines the path of their life. And it produces something that I remember him calling an economic life sentence, okay? Built-in disadvantage when you have a record with employers hiring you, and these things follow you for so long. And so this disparity in treatment follows people throughout their entire lives because of the course that's set so early.
Karen, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the factors that make a child particularly at risk for contact with the juvenile justice system.
Sure, there's what's called the Cradle to Prison Pipeline, which is through the Children's Fund, and they talk about these factors, the pervasive poverty, especially in minority cultures, inadequate health care that mothers and children have, the gap in the early childhood development that continues to follow them in their education, the disparity in educational opportunities, intolerable abuse and neglect, that was mentioned, just in the different kinds of homes, unmet mental and emotional problems, substance abuse, overburden, and ineffective justice system as some other factors. Another factor is sometimes quoted as people who have incarcerated parents. There's one statistic out there that 7 out of 10 children who have an incarcerated parent will go to prison, and that is a faulty statistic. The real statistic is about 3% or 30% kind of thing, 3 out of 10. It is a risk factor, but it's not a determining factor for those children. So sometimes even ministries misuse statistics to try and gain some money and funding, but really it's not a destiny for those who have a parent who's incarcerated, but it's a combination of all of these different risk factors together. And this is where I think the church can step in, and we think about prison ministry. Instead, we need to think about prevention and instead begin to address some of these issues to help prevent kids even going into the system.
Stephanie, Mike mentioned it, but well over half of the youth who are in the system are there for committing a nonviolent offense, and that's also the case in the adult criminal justice system, and it's a big problem. So I'm wondering, it doesn't quite seem logical, so I'm wondering what might the role of community alternatives be for nonviolent offenders?
Sure. So there's a couple inflection points here, and this is something we tried to articulate a little bit in the book, that the top referrer for young people into the juvenile justice system is actually the education system. So you have school systems that have discipline policies that send young people into an engagement with this system rather than try to address some of the challenges, things like missed breakfast, parental arguments, those types of things, in the context of a school environment. And some of that has been around trying to take seriously violent crime within schools. So they have access to school resource officers on hand who are police officers. So they have kind of ready-made routes for students to become involved with the system. But there really is a significant inflection point Now, the piece that I think is particularly important as you think about this, sort of like, okay, what can I possibly do to impact that? But school discipline policies are set either at the school level or at a district level. And so these are really things that in your local community have significant possibility to change. But it requires folks who are going to speak up and say, we need to divert these kids from these policies that send them into the justice system in a way that they essentially become entrapped in it for things like skipping school, for mouthing off at a teacher, for things that are not violent offenses at all, but get them kicked out of school, and depending on the severity or the frequency of that behavior, end them up and involved with the system. So there's some significant inflection points there. I think the other piece is really the diversion piece of how do we not have kids who are committing nonviolent crimes end up in the justice system from, say, getting picked up for, underage drinking or something like that. And this is a place where the community-based alternatives is really crucial. And again, something that every person in this room who's a member of a congregation actually has access to as an opportunity. Also, folks who are involved with faith-based organizations have access to as an opportunity. And this is the thing I was talking about that I had no idea what it was when I was 21 running a youth center. This really is an opportunity to become healing communities for folks who have gotten into a little bit of trouble and not make that kid mop the floor, but put that kid in a community of relationships. We work with a gentleman named Dean Trulier, and Dean's contention is that you really need to be a person who takes seriously the fact that folks are hungry for relationship. And so he actually recommends that churches and faith-based organizations become alternative sentencing sites, and that the community service people do has to maximize their relationship with the community itself. So rather than mowing a lawn or mopping the floor, his recommendations are things like make sure that that person works at your church's food bank with the people from the church. Make sure that young person goes with you on hospital visits. Make sure that young person goes and visits the nursing home or the shut-ins, where they're in relationships with other people in the community and restored by virtue of those engagements to the community, that they're not marginalized further. Again, we're not talking in situations like this about people who need to be confined because they have a violent criminal history or they have a mental illness that they need to have treatment for, or that they need to go to substance abuse treatment. We're talking about folks who really need just to straight up never enter the system at all and just remain in their communities in relationships that are stronger.
I just want to echo the relational component. In the book, we talk about an organization called the Youth Advocate Program, which is actually located right in Chicago nearby. And they're really at the top of their field. Their model is replicated across the country, and they call it a wraparound model. So they assign youth either before they've entered the system or if they're in an alternative mandated appointment, a mentor that is with them for, not just for a month or two, but for years, and meets with them several times a week. The wraparound model really heavily focuses on family, so the mentor will be involved with the child's family, with their school, with their counselors. So that I just wanted to, if you're interested in learning more, the Youth Advocate Program is one that's worth looking into. Mike, my next question is for you, and as many of you probably know, Washington is not super well known for bipartisan efforts right now, but juvenile justice is actually one space where there is a lot of bipartisan consensus on reform. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about why you think that is, and then if you're hopeful for true reform coming in the next few years.
In the last few years, you really have seen a lot of momentum, a lot of action on this set of issues. Some of that is rooted in a couple of Supreme Court decisions that mixed up the system, that banned automatic life sentences for minors and did some other things that forced people to take a look at the system that they had created, and the system of routine incarceration that included juveniles. So there was a court element to that, and these decisions, when you read them, they go to great lengths to take into account the insights of neuroscience, the way adolescents are different than adults. They're not just mini adults, they have a different set of needs. It's the time where you have risk-taking and impulsiveness and poor decision-making skills and all these things together. So they make a kind of interesting case in some of these Supreme Court decisions. Most of the action is taking place on the state level, and not just in the places you'd think. So, not just in blue states like California. Some of the largest reforms have come in Georgia and Texas, and just a few days ago in Kansas, which is a very, very conservative state. Some of this is motivated by an argument that in a place like Georgia, for example, for a long-term detention facility for juveniles, they spend about $91,000 per bed per year. That's a serious amount of money. And you find even a fraction of alternatives, you can fund other services in much more aggressive ways. And I think they're finding that that's a better balance in a variety of places. And so, those old programs in Georgia had like a 65% recidivism rate, and many of these programs that try to keep people in their families or in their communities instead of isolated in jail, a lot of them have reductions in recidivism rates of about 20%. So these are serious successes on these programs that you can fund, with these by reducing the number of beds that are necessary for long-term. It is also, there's almost no action on this issue, real action on this issue in the law on the federal level, but you're still seeing some agreement. There are bills out there. I know there's a Senate bill that's supported by Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and Tim Scott of South Carolina, Charles Grassley, that talks about curbing in the federal system, curbing the use of solitary confinement, allowing a better process for expunging records so that these things don't follow people the rest of their lives. That gives judges more leeway. That's, I think, a lot of the trend here is that giving judges the ability to treat people as individuals instead of applying sentencing standards in a rigid way. So at all those levels, the court, the states, the federal government, and of course a lot of action when people come back into communities, it's local communities that have to deal with the transition. So I think an exception to a lot of the partisan rancor of our time.
Karen, you touched on it a little bit, but I want you to say some more about the role of the church and the role of that Christians can play, in particular, in caring for and welcoming these youth and their families.
Sure, I think especially in juveniles, oftentimes they are not ministered with. Typically people go into prisons or into jails and minister with adults, and the juveniles are often forgotten. So I think, starting there of ministering with finding out which juvenile, where are the juveniles in your county, where are they held, what are their needs, is part of a way to start. Another one is working with foster care and being in that ministry or safe parenting, safe homes, serving in those ways of coming alongside parents who need a break or working with children who are a little higher risk, especially in the juvenile setting, inviting them into your youth group. And some people might think that's pretty scary. And so, we're helping them to go to camp. So there's lots of ways, but it's risky, it's messy, so to speak, but that's not what God calls us to be, is to live in a safe, protected world. We need to be wise, but I think that we need to also acknowledge the fears that we have and wondering if that's keeping us from doing what God's called us.
Stephanie, next question is for you. And one of the things that really cannot be ignored when thinking about this issue is the racial disparities that exist. And one statistic nationally says that 1 in 106 white males over 18 are incarcerated. For black males, that number is 1 in 15. So, those trends are also evident in the juvenile justice system. And as you mentioned, if you are a black or brown youth, your odds of getting put in the system for the same crime as a white youth are much, much higher. So how can we begin to address this? What can we even look towards?
Again, I sort of think about the potential inflection points, right? Where are there opportunities to change it? Because it's not as simple as saying, okay, we're going to just have one rule and that's going to solve the problem. These are incredibly complex problems. One inflection point, though, really is in the courts themselves. So in making transitions for things like shackling youth, and there's a pretty significant movement to reduce the practice of shackling young people. And that alone, in terms of how young people are presented in a courtroom, is fairly significant in reducing some of the disparities that exist based on race. Another is this practice that I spoke of detaining someone while they're awaiting being presented in front of a judge versus taking them home. And that's a pretty significant change that can also help. So a young person appearing from the street side door in street clothes significantly helps the visual effect that leads to some of these disparities as well. I also think there's a significant amount of work that can be done within the context of folks who are working on the prosecutor side. And so I have met truly wonderful prosecutors who exercise their authority and responsibility with incredible sensitivity towards human dignity. And I have also met prosecutors who unfortunately have significant ambitions to be viewed in their communities as tough on crime because they're seeking a higher elected office. And one of the challenges there is that any case then looks like an opportunity to be tough on crime. And so one of the challenges is really, I think, working alongside prosecutors to help prosecutors not be incentivized in a direction that they're rewarded by voters for being tough on black and brown boys.
Karen, this next question is for you, but anyone can chime in. So kind of just to zoom out in the big picture of things, why are we talking about this issue? So there are some really serious, what we call collateral consequences of spending time, even a short amount of time in a locked facility. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what some of those consequences of having a criminal record are.
Sure. Recently, I had a guy in my office who had done, I think, a couple years in prison, and he is now getting his MDiv at Trinity. And he said, a guy said to him, you did the crime, right? Well, then you need to do the time. And I would say to that, then he did the time, then he's out, and so he should be a full citizen as opposed to a second-class citizen. They have a life sentence. Anybody with a felony is a life sentence. They are never at equal level with everybody else in society. Collateral sanctions may include where they can live, checking the box on the application of having a felony record. Some states don't allow you to vote. Sometimes you can't be on a jury. You may lose parental rights. You may be ineligible for student loans and educational loans. So there's a whole list of, you can't own a gun. There's just a whole list of things that are forever a part of your life. And you can never be a full citizen again on equal level with everybody else in the community. So,
one thing that I think, one hopeful thing, just from the science of criminal justice, is that close to 90% of all juvenile offenders desist from criminality by their mid-20s. That period from adolescence up to the mid-20s is really the danger zone. And people really do change their lives in that transition to adulthood. It's not an exception. Actually, that's the rule. People that have been involved, that have felony convictions, have been involved in criminality, most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, no longer commit crimes after that period. And so, I think our institutions should reflect that. I once did a column a few years ago now in West Garfield Park here in Chicago, which takes more returning prisoners than any community in America. And I talked to some of the returning people, and they mentioned all the issues that you were talking about. I talked to one man who wanted to stay with his mother in public housing, but is not allowed to because of his felony background, and problems with getting identification and problems in getting and keeping jobs. We have a system that really does view people as second-class citizens for the rest of their lives, and people often live up or down to expectations. That's the nature of things. So.
Yeah, one other area is, and this is where they kind of feel locked out of society after they've been locked up, and even certain career paths are out of reach for them. They're no longer possible. If you go into healthcare or education or anything that needs a licensing by the state, oftentimes they're prohibited from going in that direction because of their felony.
And there's actually policies that have been developed in certain states along the lines of things like you have to get a license to be a barber.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yet they were a barber in prison.
Okay, one more question for each of you, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So we're speaking to a room mostly full of college students. So I'm wondering, what are some practical pieces of advice you might offer a student who's interested in these ideas, maybe encountering them for the first time? What are some next steps to kind of learn more and work in this space? And let each of you take a chance at that.
I think that if I was on a college campus, that I would want to know what's happening in the community around me. So I would want to know some of the statistics about juvenile sentencing. I would want to understand what the school discipline policies are. I would want to know what alternative sentences look like in this community. Who's providing them? Are they here? And I would want to know kind of what the overall perspective on the criminal activity of youth is within this community. So those are the questions I might ask as a person who's here. And I would want to know what organizations are working to help be part of the solution to those things. I would also want to understand the state level legislation that's at play around reforming these things. And kind of what's going on there, what changes have existed. If we were in a different state, I could rattle off some statistics for you right now that would give you some examples of some major changes, right? Katie and I were in a room with a bunch of folks from Arizona where they were celebrating that in the matter of a couple of years, only 60% of youth showed up in court in shackles. But the answer used to be 100%. And so that was a major deal for them to have made that decision in their courts. So I think there's those components. And if you hear those things, you'll see a pretty clear role that you have as a citizen in a political community that you share with your neighbors. You also hear a role that you have as a member of a church to be a healing community. You also have a role as a person who's going into your major. I think about this with, business majors alone. Just think about the business opportunities that are not open and the possibilities of really being restorative in someone's life when you're a person who's willing to hire someone with a criminal record. I think there are significant opportunities for everyone who is in this room to step into a place that isn't like, oh, you have to become a policy expert. It's something that's pretty adjacent to where you are right now, and you could just do one thing. So those would be the types of things I would encourage.
Just to add one thing, if you ask a real expert in social policy, a political scientist, a social scientist, somebody like John DiIulio at the University of Pennsylvania, what the most successful interventions are, particularly in the lives of children. All of the social science points to mentoring-type relationships. And the extraordinary thing about it is it doesn't even take a whole lot of hours per week to have a huge impact on someone's life. And of course, that makes intuitive sense as well. I mean, what children need most are people in their lives that are crazy about them. That's what they need the most. Parents, coaches, pastors, people that think they're wonderful, think they're valuable. And so, mentoring is one of those areas where you can make, with relatively small investment of hours, just make dramatic impact in people's lives.
I would recommend that everyone go to jail or prison at some point to see the people who are there, because it might the TV doesn't always the media doesn't always give the most accurate picture of those behind bars. I would encourage you not to go on as a tour, but as ministry, shadowing someone else as they do ministry there. So we're not gaping at people who are behind bars, but we're really trying to get to know them and understand them. The other thing I guess I would encourage is kind of going with Dean Trulier's thing of having Wheaton be a place of healing community. Because I know there's people here on this campus who have a loved one who's incarcerated. It might not be the immediate family, it might be a cousin, but it might be a dad or an uncle or somebody. But people don't talk about it because of the stigma and shame that's often accompanied to it. And so I would hope that this would be a safe place, a place of healing, and some place where people can talk about, the challenges of having a loved one who's incarcerated.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. So just a few things. First, I'm going to pick on students' questions first, just so you know. And when you have a question, if you could stand and say your name, and then direct your question either if you have a particular panelist or to all of them, that would be great. Claire or Chelsea back here will be running around with these. Oh, actually, we're set up, so sorry. If you have a question, just come on up to the mic and go.
Must be someone.
Got one, two.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thanks a lot for coming. Your panel really meant a lot to me. As a resident of a big city, Philadelphia, where the statistics can be a little bit stark. My question for you is, if I were to leave and forget everything you said, with this consideration in mind, my objective is to go into federal law enforcement as a career. That's been my aspiration for a long time. And I want to do that with the understanding that with the nature of my work, I don't want to perpetuate all of the downsides of these outcomes. And so if I leave and forget everything, what is the bottom line consideration for practitioners of law enforcement? Thank you.
So I think I would probably I'm going to let everybody else answer this too. Mine would be diversion, actually helping kids stay out of the juvenile justice system in the first place. And praise God, I'm really glad that is what you want to do. My husband's mentee's mom decided to become a police officer because of what she saw happening in her community. And, people thought she was insane. It's like, you want to join those folks? What's wrong with you? But it has provided such a significant source of strength and hope and really opened up some really serious, significant conversations within her neighborhood. So thank you.
You can see, there are some cities that do it well, where police officers are involved in prevention efforts, are present in the community, are trusted, and And then there's some communities that do it poorly. And I think, this is going to be the important thing we take away from the events of the last few years is we need to learn the lessons of what works in these areas that keep order without destroying and alienating communities themselves. And I guess the great thing there is I just think there are good examples out there. It's not as though no one can do this. There are actually whole cities that have implemented approaches that, that keep order while building community trust, and it's really possible.
And I would say, remember, everyone you encounter is made in the image of God, and to treat them with dignity and respect. And also guard your heart against cynicism and, just against cynicism. Yeah.
If I could add to that, I was actually just reading yesterday a Malcolm Gladwell book who, in it, he profiles a police department, one of the precincts in New York, actually, and a chief came in, really high crime rates among adolescents, so 18 to 26-year-olds. And most of the contact that those kids had prior with the police departments were, the people who take away, their father or their cousin or them. So that's the narrative they have of, there's this hole in my life and the police are creating it in a way. And she wanted to rewrite that narrative. So what she did, they got a list of the youth who had been in the system and were now released, knowing that recidivism rates can be very high. And they essentially followed those kids, stayed on top of their schoolwork. They met and went to meet with their families if the families were willing. And kind of it was a forced mentorship in a way, and at first it was resisted. And he just tells these great stories of, on Thanksgiving, the day of, they thought, well, why don't we just bring some turkeys over to the families of these kids? So they show up at the door and say, we're actually here for you. This is a relational thing. We want to invest in your family. And they saw crime rates drop over the next few years. So I can talk to you more about that, but that was just a fascinating example of the impact of relationships. Okay. Other questions?
I was telling my friend I can't help myself. I am a juvenile court judge here in DuPage County. I'm one of 2 juvenile court judges. And we've been very fortunate in DuPage County. We worked closely with, our probation department worked closely with a group called the MacArthur Foundation. And they funded something called Models for Change. Yeah. And we've been involved with them for a number of years. And we actually incarcerate few, if any, kids in DuPage County. I checked before coming today because I thought this might come up. And in DuPage County today, we're a county of about 1 million people. We have 10 kids in our juvenile detention facility. So it's our probation department does remarkable work. And we do have sentencing alternatives in response to some of the things that Stephanie was saying. But we also have, and I'm going to embarrass them, we've got someone here from our DuPage County Probation Department who has done wonderful work, and they work extensively with kids in the community so that we don't have to lock kids up. We also have someone here from, stand up, please stand up, someone here from Wheaton Youth Outreach, and you talked about what can students do. And, whoop, wrong one, sorry, from Wheaton Youth Outreach, and talked about what can students do. So see her after. And then we also have, it's Northeast, what's the? Yeah, Northeast DuPage Family and Youth Services. And they do a lot of work. Many of the children that we see in the juvenile court have suffered extensive trauma in their lives, and they work very well with those children, and we have specific programs. And so again, you should stand up and wave so that everybody can. You should see her as well, and there would be things that could be done there. We also have a lot of alternatives to actually going into the juvenile court system. Kids who see me it's sort of the beginning of failure sometimes, although hopefully, thanks to our probation department, we have a lot of success. But we have a lot of alternatives for children in DuPage County. But, and I guess this sort of boils down then to my question after my long little speech
No, that
here,
was
sorry.
awesome.
The, one of the problems that we have is in the state of Illinois right now, Michael jokingly referred to the situation in Washington. The situation in the state of Illinois is worse than the situation in Washington. We do not have a budget. Many of the agencies that I was just talking about are in significant financial distress because of that.
Yeah.
And so I'd like, I'm going to make one suggestion. I'd like to hear from the three of you as to other suggestions that you might have. My suggestion is that we should not sit idly by, and I would pray that all of you would contact your state representatives and the governor to say, get past this. We have to get a budget. We have to fund these agencies, because a lot of the alternatives that I'm talking about, we're losing the funding for that. But I would welcome suggestions from the three of you on that, and I apologize. That was a really long question.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. Have thoughts on solving Illinois' budget impasse?
I'll respond non-responsively. It is really an example of how important public service can be, about good people being engaged in important jobs and creating a construct in which it's possible to serve the common good. So it's not just doing, the important work is not just doing outreach to a single child, which is essential and important, but it's also actually creating a social structure or system that allow a community to flourish. And that's a moral calling. That's something that people should be involved in as citizens, but also as participants. And so, I would really urge young people, as I often do, to understand that government can't do everything, but it does absolutely essential things. And getting it right is important for communities rich and poor. So the general calling of public service is something that should be considered a possible Christian calling.
I do think in this, kind of contact your legislator piece, one of the things that I think is difficult is when legislators are presented with constituents who sort of give them no options. So I found that sometimes it's more helpful if there are any ways that you can see the impasse and see something that might be an area of agreement, to be able to outline the agreement and acknowledge that we're not going to come to agreement about all these things, but here's the thing that I think you can agree is necessary, and here's the consequence of doing nothing while we are bunkered in right now. That might not unlock it, but it at least provides relief from kind of a, why are you guys such knuckleheads because you can't compromise, instead to actually point out the potential area of agreement as a way forward, at least in some short-term way. I'm from the state of Pennsylvania, and we have exactly the same thing going on right now there. So, the frustration there is very palpable, but it's definitely in a conversation where there's just no room to budge. So if there's ways for folks to say, here's a place where we can see some agreement, can we work there? So in making those calls, helping tee up something positive that can happen, as opposed to just say, why can't you guys get it together?
And just to mention another theme in the book itself, in Unleashing Opportunity, one of the most despicable things that happens in this is that states get into budget problems and turn to the lottery and gambling as a way to make up government revenues that are disproportionately hurt people of lower incomes. It's just a perfect example of an abdication of responsibility where the attempted cover is the exploitation of the poor. That's just, it's a scandal, and we're seeing it all across the country. So.
I'm part of the science departments here at Wheaton as a student in those majors, and this is a topic that absolutely never gets brought up among us. And so I was curious from that perspective, something that isn't always addressed at these talks is what healthcare looks like for those who are imprisoned, and what you guys see there, as well as healthcare that in communities that are largely in these underserved and going in and out of the justice system areas.
Not totally.
Could you repeat the first part of that question?
What studies you've
Maybe
done?
get a little closer, maybe.
Yeah.
Sorry, the problem of healthcare in the justice system among the imprisoned, and what studies you guys do on that topic, and what proposals have been made.
I don't have anything on,
you don't?
on the healthcare.
Environmental.
Yeah.
I can invite one of you to.
I think you have found an area outside of the competency of everyone on this panel to comment. I'm sorry that we're not able to do more. Is there somebody here who could speak to that? Because we'd be happy to connect you.
Yeah,
It's a great question.
it is.
Yeah, and mental health issues play an essential role in all this too, and
Yeah.
prevention. So,
Yeah.
Great.
okay, good.
I think this young woman did you have a question too? Okay.
I did have a question. First of all, Wheaton students, the Institute for Prison Ministries doesn't get a lot of publicity, but if you are interested in prison ministries, Karen Swanson is a really great resource, so you should pay her a visit in the BGC. But my question is that you talked a lot about alternative sentencing options for nonviolent juvenile offenders, but are there any kind of alternative sentencing options for violent juvenile offenders beyond just the corrections department?
Yes, there are. And, part of the movement to essentially only lock up juveniles as a requirement of some treatment protocol is the thing that's sort of gaining steam. And the piece that is also going along with that is to have much more small facilities, so group home style facilities as opposed to large warehouse style facilities. So there's whole states that have basically put themselves on a track to close their large facilities and really only require incarceration in the situations where there's actually a treatment protocol that needs to be administered in that type of environment. Yeah.
Thank you guys for coming. I was just curious because I don't remember hearing any of you guys talk about changing or eliminating any of the laws that are actually broken when people enter the system. Do you guys not see that as changes or to petty drug laws or just public order laws as viable solutions to these issues?
Well, I'm generally a skeptic of legalization. I think that having another drug that is taxed and gains that legitimacy has other negative social effects. But right now, this is the good thing about states, a federal system, is we're undergoing some experiments on these, on how this works out. I have a little bit of a challenge, like in Colorado, the first several $1 million gained in taxing marijuana was used for school construction. And we used to have schools that were known as drug-free school zones. And now, will they put a plaque on it, built by drug money? There are conflicting social messages that are sent in this situation. But, I'm against using routine incarceration for matters like this, which even in a kind of three strikes context, which I think can be really problematic. So I don't think that justice requires legalization, but I do think that it requires viewing people that have nonviolent offenses in a different way, and having a system that recognizes the distinction.
And I do think that there are some pieces where things that would be status offenses, so truancy and such, there's different ways to treat those. And there's examples of different ways to treat those than, ending up into the system. So I do think there are some places where there's clarity there. I think as we're speaking to this, we're trying to speak to the thing that probably has maximum impact. And when you think about the ways that you have replicable models across states, we're kind of looking at the thing that would make the most sweeping impact, particularly in light of disparity.
My name's Thor Celine. I'm a program manager with the Department of Probation and Wheaton resident and city council member. And I'm on the city council, so I can tell you we won't vote for gambling in Wheaton. So no worries there. That's a consensus among the 7 of us. But I would like just to give an anecdotal example. One of Wheaton grads is a supervisor in the Department of Probation. He's been there over 30 years, Bill Borgeson. And he and I have been working with, he came to me with an idea. There's a young man who is currently on supervision. He's in an alternative school, not in a public school, for behavioral issues, not because he needs the academic stimulation. And his mom asked if we could find some mentoring for him. So this goes out to all the college students. We are in the midst of creating with Young Life an opportunity to assign 2 young men in Young Life who are at Wheaton College to call on this youth, to invite him to each Young Life event, to befriend him and introduce him, and then hopefully some mentoring will come out of that. So please consider that as an option for you. My question to you is about emerging adults and the idea, this new, on the spectrum of human development, the emerging adult is the 17 to 29-year-old. There's been a lot of research out about the physiology and the biology of the human brain not really being able to, and it goes to Mr. Gerson's point earlier where he says they desist from doing crime when they get to be about 25. But we have a hard and fast juvenile versus adult line drawn in the sand of 18, where juvenile is thinking about restoration, adult is more punitive. So do you have any thoughts on whether we should increase or how we might, what sort of services we might try to bring to play in the juvenile justice system for these young emerging adults?
I think it generally makes sense to concentrate resources and interventions in the portion of the life cycle in which this is the greatest problem. And that's not just till they're 18 years old. I mean, I think you make a very good point. These processes of neuroscience that we're talking about, that relate to impulsiveness and risk-taking and a lot of these other problems, don't change overnight when you make, when you can drink at 21 or, they're a more gradual process, and we should be concentrating the resources where it would make the most difference.
Any other questions?
It's great to hear that DuPage County has got a lot of stuff together. However, I teach in Chicago, And it's a little different in Chicago and in Cook counties, as Karen will tell you, specifically Cook County Jail, where in Illinois, we build prisons by looking at the third grade reading scores of kids. That's how we decide to build prisons. And so my point is that since you all mentioned education as being important, and Wheaton College is an educational institution, what can Wheaton College do as an institution educationally to better the circumstances so that we can even start at the beginning, where young people don't even get close to the system of being in trouble and things like that. But since Wheaton College has a history of, from abolitionism to all sorts of social justice, what can we continue to do educationally as an institution to help solve this problem?
Well, I do know that there's several, I'm not sure exactly what the exact programs are with the education program, but there's a lot of Wheaton students over at the Outreach Center and connecting with students there as mentors and tutors and that kind of thing. So I think there is some effort right now between different programs that connect with Outreach Center to help kids on the educational level. So.
Your mention of early reading scores was frightening to me. I have a column tomorrow in the Washington Post where I mention that close to 80% of African American fourth graders are not reading at age level. And more than 80% of Latino fourth graders are not reading at grade level. There are, in fact, probably around 6.5 million young people in America who are not in school and not in jobs. That's an extraordinary group of people that have essentially slipped through the cracks of American life and the concern of our institutions. So, if the problem is education, it's we've been through a lot of attempted reforms, and it ends up being difficult. And a few people want to take responsibility for failure. So I see it as a serious problem. I used to be more hopeful on the education reform side, but we've seen a significant backlash, really a combination of the left, which did not like elements of school reform from the 2000s, and the right that wants no federal role in education at all and wants weak regulation. I think we're actually going backward on standards, accountability, transparency, all those things that might make some difference in our education system.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but if you could join me in thanking our panelists. Michael.